Thank you very much, Professor Bagchi.
ওয়েবিনারে আছি। Thank you.
To begin with, I thank Professor Mahalakshmi, History Congress, for this webinar. I'm thankful and honored that she is chairing. Guru, Professor Irfan Habib, I'm honored that he's just. I speak today less student of history and more citizen, deeply disturbed at the I'm sorry, the connection got lost for a moment. As I said, some of the questions that I shall ask are the following. What were the values that went into the imagination of the Indian nation? What Rabindranath Tagore called the idea of India. Where were these values drawn from? Why was it able to capture the minds and hearts of the vast multitudes of an extremely diverse Indian people, despite powerful counters posed to it? How was the Indian imagination of what values should constitute the nation different from other imaginations of a nation? Lastly, what I will not deal with is in today's talk is why and how these values are under severe threat today. But what one hopes to do is that through a proper understanding of the values of our national liberation struggle, one of the biggest mass movements in world history, and its deep roots will give us the hope, the courage, the wherewithal to fight the evil which is looming so large over our country. An evil which threatens to wipe out that something which was vital and evolving, vital and enduring in Indian civilization, about which Nehru spoke so poetically in The Discovery of India. Nehru said, India could not have continued a cultural existence for thousands of years if she had not possessed something very vital and enduring, something that was worthwhile. What was that something? Nehru asks. It reminds you of Iqbal. कुछ बात है कि हस्ती मिटती नहीं हमारी, despite centuries of turmoil. Nehru seeks the answer for this in his Discovery of India, and he pores over the long Indian history from the ancient past to the medieval period to the recent years, and is trying to find an answer to enable him to find the inspiration for creating the struggle to counter the destruction of all that India stood for that was occurring under colonialism. It is quite amazing, actually, that how Nehru, writing from prison in the 1940s, raises so many of the questions that Professor Irfan Habib raised today, from precisely looking at this huge canvas of Indian civilization from the Harappan civilization till the 19th and the 20th century. I shall return to this aspect of Nehru's inquiry into the past and what he finds in India's cultural past a little later. I shall first very briefly chalk out the values which were enshrined in the idea of India, the vision that went into the making of the modern Indian nation. values which formed the basis of our constitution after independence. This was a vision that was shared across a very wide spectrum of the Indian national movement. It was not Nehru's or Gandhi's idea. It was not one section of the national movement and the other. This idea of India that we are talking about was shared by the moderates, the extremists, the Gandhians, the socialists, the communists, the revolutionaries, everybody, except, of course, the communalists and the loyalists. And it is this, the basic conception of that idea I'll lay out for you. There were, of course, differences on several other issues, but on these basic conceptions, vision, there was an agreement. But one, of course, that of sovereignty and anti-imperialism, that India would be a free country, it would not become a junior partner to any country, and nor would it subjugate others after independence, and it would, in fact, fight for the freedom of others. These are all sort of very dear ideas to most leaders of the Indian national movement. And second, and extremely important in today's context, was democracy. From a very early period, I mean, as early as the 19th century, late 19th century, Tilak is talking of adult franchise before it becomes common parlance in the rest of the world. He's talking of adult franchise. He's talking of each citizen, irrespective of class, caste, religion, gender, color, race, language, having an equal right in the decision-making of the country. I may digress a bit here, because since the NRC and the CAA has raised so many issues about who's an Indian citizen, and since being a contemporary historian, I cannot resist keep referring to what is happening right under our noses. I will simply quote to you what Gandhiji had to say about this, about who is a citizen of India, and then I shall return to the general discussion that we are having. Gandhiji said in 1942, when he was told, when he was deeply disturbed by reports coming in that the RSS was using slogans saying that Hindustan belongs to Hindus and no one else, and drive out the English, and then we shall subjugate the Muslims. And if they do not listen, we shall kill them. This report comes to Gandhiji, and in response to this, on 9th August, very interestingly, 9th August 1942, he writes, Hindustan belongs to all those who are born and bred here and have no other country to go to. Therefore, it belongs to Parsis, to Beni Israelis, to Indian Christians, to Muslims, to other non-Hindus. He mentions every small community that he can think of, as much as to Hindus. Free India will be no Hindu Raj. It will be an Indian Raj based not on the majority of any religion or sect or community, but on the representatives of the whole people without distinction of any religion. Democracy for the Indian national movement was not going to be only in words or an objective, but was to be practiced while pursuing the movement itself. Important decisions in the movement were based on open discussion and debate and open expression of those differences. For example, the decision to start the non-cooperation movement in 1920 in Calcutta was taken after open debate and voting. And about 1,886 people voted for, and 884 voted against Gandhiji's resolution. Even more stark example is when Gandhiji, on Gandhiji's resolution condemning the bomb attack on the Viceroy's train, that resolution was challenged and was passed by a narrow margin of 942 for and 794 against. Democracy also meant for the Indian national movement dissent and respect for the opposite view. It also meant civil liberties and a free press being completely non-negotiable. And this was true. This was argued from Ramon Roy, Tilak, Gandhi, Nehru. I mean, this was a constant refrain that civil liberties, the right of dissent, must be respected. The best example of this, perhaps, is when 13 communists, members of the AICC, voted against the Quit India resolution. A movement which galvanized the whole country. You can imagine the huge enthusiasm, and 13 communists in the AICC opposed the resolution. Gandhiji clearly protect the communists who took a position which could cause much popular discord. At the beginning of his do or die speech says, "I congratulate the 13 friends who voted against the resolution. In doing so, they had nothing to be ashamed of. For the last 20 years, we have tried to learn not to lose courage, even when we are in a hopeless minority of one, and we are laughed at. It behoves us to cultivate this courage of conviction, for it ennobles man and raises his moral stature. I was therefore glad to see that these friends had imbibed the principle which I have tried to follow in the last 50 years and more." So this aspect of the national movement, and particularly Gandhiji, is perhaps it is this what led Lenin to call Gandhi a revolutionary. The fact that he brought the people into action, the masses of people into action, and that he did not prevent they being mobilized to any other further more revolutionary movements. It is important to remember the distinction, excuse me, to return to the basic constituents of the idea of India. After democracy, the third major element was secularism. In fact, it emerges from democracy itself. At that time, the term democracy and secular were used coterminously. You talked of secular democracy. There cannot be a democracy without secularism, and there could not be a secularism without democracy. And so this was a very, very important part of the common consensus, as I said, from the right to the left of the Indian nationalists. And lastly, there was a consensus on a pro-poor orientation. Not necessarily socialist, though that view was increasingly becoming stronger and stronger after the 1920s, but there was nevertheless a consensus on a pro-poor orientation from the moderate Dadabhai Naoroji days. If you look at the writings of Naoroji, Dutt, Surendranath Banerjee, you find that the poor are very much in the center of their inquiry, down to Nehru and then to, of course, Gandhi and his focus towards the Daridra Narayan, the socialists and the communists. This, I'd very briefly like to mention, was a very brave and unique imagination of a nation and nationalism, in sharp contrast to how modern nation states were being imagined elsewhere in the world. European nation states, as they emerged, they emerged as homogeneous units, one language, one religion. Catholic France, Italy, the unification of Italy, the unification of Germany. It's one language, one religion, and was the mode. The French Revolution actually flattened out France. France was a multilingual country and was made into a one-language country. The Indian imagination was, on the other hand, exactly the opposite. It would celebrate diversity. Multiple cultures, multiple languages were seen as complementary, not contradictory to each other. The best Urdu poet, the best Bengali literature, the best Telugu reformer, the best Tamil poet were also the best nationalists. They were complementary. The second difference was that the European nation states, as we know, emerged with the rise of capitalism, and inherent in the rise of capitalism was the rise of imperialism and colonialism. These two processes almost occurred simultaneously. So there was, in that conception of nationalism, an aggrandizing, a dominating element, an element which was absent in the Indian vision of nationalism. It was liberating, it was humanist, it was anti-imperialist. The reason why I mention this at this time is because it is important to remember this distinction between these two nationalisms in our times. Because it is this European vision which, unless checked by radical movements, as it was in many countries in Europe, it ended up in its logical conclusion of the Hitlers and the Mussolinis. And it is this alien vision of a narrow, single, homogeneous, aggressive, aggrandizing nationalism which is now being masqueraded as the genuine Indian nationalism. And who's masquerading it? It is being masqueraded by what we would call the fake nationalists, those who were not part of the Indian national movement, who fell out of this spectrum, which believed in the idea of India, who in fact sided with the colonial authorities. Moving on to the question, where were the values propagated by the national movement over nearly 100 years? Where were they drawn from? The values of democracy, freedom, reason, rationality, scientific temper, tolerance, secularism, etc. No longer the Eurocentric view can be sustained that these values emanated in Europe during the Enlightenment because of some innate qualities that Europe possessed, the kind of argument which Professor Bagchi has demolished so successfully in many of his writings. That view cannot be held, that it emanates in Europe and the rest of the world was to follow and learn from this. In fact, this Eurocentric view of the spread of Enlightenment became the intellectual and ideological justification of imperialism, the civilizing mission. Europe has acquired this truth and it will now civilize the rest of the world by transmitting it to them. It is time to recognize that there were globally alternate routes to modernity. I'm very fond of citing the German historian Dietmar Rothermund in this context, where he contrasted two emperors who ruled for roughly 40 years as early as the 16th century, that is a few centuries before the European Enlightenment, Akbar of India and Philip II of Spain. Akbar talking of reason, rationality, tolerance, universal peace, freedom of thought, rights of women. He, in fact, as we heard, organizes institutional debates in which various religious thinkers and even atheists were invited. He promotes the Sufi Chishti tradition of non-violence, etc. And on the other hand, you have Philip II doing the Spanish inquests, where tens of thousands were killed for committing religious heresy. Indian nationalists undoubtedly drew from the powerful trends globally emanating from European Enlightenment, including the rising left and Marxist thinking that emerged in the world. But they also drew from India's past. They drew from India's traditions of reason, humanisms, tolerance, science, etc., and tried to establish a historical linkage with it. And in so doing, gave a distinct character to the Enlightenment project that occurred in the Indian situation. I would come back to this towards the end of my talk, that by linking up with the past, the manner in which the future was invented was definitely determined, affected. Jawaharlal Nehru, as I said earlier, makes a conscious effort to link with the past in his discovery of India. I'll very briefly bring to your attention some of what he draws from India's history. He was not a professional historian. I'm sure on many counts he may be wrong, but from what I heard today, on many counts he seems to have got the essence of what needed to be got out of Indian history. But let me give you a quick review as I read through the discovery of India while preparing today's talk. It was absolutely a fascinating experience. Beginning with the Indus Valley civilization, he calls it a predominantly secular civilization, where the religious element, though may be present, did not dominate. He contrasts it with Egypt and Mesopotamia, where he says there were magnificent temples for the gods and lavish palaces were built, while the people had to be content with mud dwellings. In the Indus Valley, he says the picture is reversed. The finest structures were created for the convenience of citizens. Following the eclipse of this civilization, Nehru says there came the Aryans from Central Asia, the Iranians, the Greeks, the Parthians, the Bactrians, the Scythians, the Huns, the Turks before Islam, the early Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, and later the Muslims. And he says, sums it up. He says they came, they made a difference, and they were absorbed. He repeatedly points out that the word Hindu does not appear in ancient times, and its use in relation to a particular religion was of a very late occurrence. He says the old inclusive term for religion was Arya Dharma or Dharma, which meant more than a religion, which meant a moral, ethical code. It included the Vedic, non-Vedic, Buddhist, Jainic. The Dharma included everybody at that time. He highlights the eternal questioning from the very early times, as Professor Habib pointed out, in the Rig Veda. He refers back to the creation hymn, and he notes the lack of dogma, the questioning of the creator itself, the element of a scientific method, the general tendency towards monism, which he says is perhaps intended to lessen the sharp differences that must have existed, a tendency towards synthesis, an opposition to magic, the supernatural, rituals, ceremonies, etc. He quotes, "He who sees the one spirit on all and all in one spirit, henceforth can look with contempt at no creature, on no creature." Overall, he says, an atmosphere of tolerance, reasonableness, free thought in matters of faith, and the desire and capacity to live and let live outlined this situation. He notes the existence of the notion of sacrifice and restraint, tapasya, being necessary for achieving knowledge or good. As we know, Gandhiji resonated with this idea. In the epics Ramayana and Mahabharata, which Nehru notes and says, which remain unparalleled in terms of exercising a pervasive and continuous influence till the present on the mass mind, which caters to a very large population. He says, the epics make us understand somewhat the secret of the old Indian in holding together a variegated society, divided up in many ways, graded in castes, in harmonizing their discords and giving them a common background or heroic tradition and ethical living. They tried to build up a unity of outlook among the people, which was to survive and overshadow all diversity. In the Mahabharata particularly, Nehru says, there is an urge to seek unity in complexity, a term that Sister Nivedita used when she read the Mahabharata, and that was one of the first things that she said was visible to an outsider. He says in Mahabharata, there is the tendency to absorb old traditions and deal with the new. The basic approach seems to have been that there could be no monopoly on truth. And there were many ways of seeing and approaching it. And this is a constant theme, as we will find, that through Indian history, that there are multiple truths, there are many ways of approaching the truth. So all kinds of different and even contradictory beliefs were tolerated. It's not surprising, therefore, that we can even speak of having 300 Ramayanas. because there was, it appears, for a very long period, this openness to alternate views. So he says, the dharma advocated in the Mahabharata and in Gita spoke of the adherence to the basic principles such as truth and non-violence. Thou shalt not do to the other what is disagreeable to thyself. The message of the Gita, he says, was non-sectarian and addressed to all groups, and which made it universally acceptable widely. Nehru goes on to outline the scientific breakthroughs. He talks of various seats of learning from Taxila to Nalanda, but he makes a special mention, which is interesting for us today, of the institution of learning in Benares, where he says there were numerous groups consisting of a teacher and disciples, consisting of one teacher and many disciples, among these groups there would be fierce debate and argument. So this tradition of argument and debate in an institutionalized form in the education system. Nehru then goes on to Buddhism and Jainism, which he calls breakaways from the Vedic religion, both of which he says lay emphasis on non-violence. Buddha, he says, attacks superstition, priestcraft, appeals to logic, to reason, to ethics, and does not recognize caste in his own order. He preaches, he's quoting, the poor and the lowly, the rich and the high, all are one. All castes unite in this religion as do the rivers in the sea. The message, he says, is universal benevolence, love to all. Never in the world does hatred cease by hatred. Hatred ceases by love. Let a man overcome anger by kindness, evil by good. You can see the links that at least Gandhi drew from this. And in the line of the openness that I just now spoke of, seen in the earlier tradition, which Nehru keeps referring to, Buddha tells his disciple, I have given you a handful of truths. But besides these, there are many thousands of other truths, more than that can be numbered. This recurring theme, as I said, was very significant, and I shall return to it later. I don't have so much time, but Nehru goes on to speak about Ashoka. I mean, he places Ashoka, like Professor Habib did, in great respect. And he talks about how he spreads Buddha's ideas and non-violence. Then he goes on to speak of the Indo-Afghan, Turkish, and Mughal rule, which he called Indo-Mughal rule, because he said the Afghan rulers, like the Mughals, integrated into India and saw India as their homeland. With these new influences coming, once again Nehru sees the process of synthesis coming in, an attempt to mitigate religious difference and oppose caste oppression. He talks of Kabir, Guru Nanak, Amir Khusro, and says this effort at synthesis was pushed by rulers themselves. And here he particularly talks of Alauddin Khalji and Akbar. He quotes he says, Akbar's ambition was not only conquest of territory, but conquest of minds and hearts of the people, so that India could be united not only politically, but organically fused into one people. He points out the intermixing of cultures in music, language, and other spheres, and he particularly talks of Khusro writing in Hindi in a dialect, and praising India in all spheres, as Professor Habib mentioned, in language, in music, in mathematics, in Sanskrit, etc. And he says composing songs 600 years ago, which are sung till today without a change of word. which he says is unprecedented. And it indeed struck me as quite amazing how popular Khusro's music and words are even today. The Mughal Rajput cooperation, he says, which included marriage, of course, as we all know, among the nobility, affected governance, administration, army, art, culture, and much else for both sides. The key features, again, he says, were assimilating, absorbing, and changing. The process, very significantly, I may add, was reflected in the border regions of northwestern India, Punjab and Sindh, for example, which witnessed numerous incursions from outside on its society from ancient times till recent times. Yet it is a region which emerged as one of the richest and foremost examples of a composite culture in literature, in music, in religion. Over the centuries, this tradition has survived. Just to give you a few examples, from Baba Farid in the 12th century to Guru Nanak and Guru Ramdas, 15th, 16th centuries, Shah Hussain in the 16th century, Sultan Bahu in the 17th century, Bulle Shah in the 17th, 18th century, Waris Shah in the 18th century, Bhai Veer Singh, Amrita Pritam, Faiz, Nusrat in the 20th century. And this 800-year-old tradition continues in the Punjab today. With this tradition, 800-year-old, which had roots in much centuries earlier, continues till today in poets and scholars like Madan Gopal Singh, who carry this tradition forward. Such examples can be multiplied in many parts of the country. So it's a very interesting phenomenon. Nehru concludes that throughout its long history in India, India was exposed to a large number of influences and shocks, and yet her basic culture survived. There must be something in that culture which gave it a dynamic strength, some inner vitality. He was completely enamored by this idea. Then he quotes Max Muller, who describes India as paradise on earth, adding one more item to the debate on who said this. And he quotes Roma Rolla, saying, if there is one place on earth where all the dreams of living men have found a home, from the very earliest days when man began the dream of existence, it is India. It is this continuity that colonialism came as a shock. To use the African revolutionary Amilcar Cabral's phrase, the history of the colonial people ceased. Indian history ceased for nearly 200 years, by which was meant that the organic process through which the Indian people had learned to negotiate difference of religion, of language, caste, etc., was now stopped. Not only was it stopped, but these differences were now frozen and in fact accentuated, so much so that the longest lasting legacy that colonialism has left behind globally is that it has left behind a divided people. A legacy, a longer lasting legacy than the political and the economic devastation was that the colonial people that they left behind have remained divided. To resist this catastrophic rupture, as Nehru saw it, brought about by colonialism, our national movement tried to draw strength from our own civilizational ethos and breakthroughs that were made in the past. And the fact that their efforts resonated with the masses had a lot to do with the fact that there was this existing ethos. I may, as an aside, say that the social reform movements, along with the national movement, resonated also very closely with this ethos. From Ram Mohan Roy defending the basic universal principles of all religion, to Keshav Chandra Sen, who went a step further, saying, our position is not that truths are to be found in all religions, but all established religions of the world are true. If I believe that my God is one and that he has created us all, I must at the same time instinctively and with all the warmth of natural feelings, look upon all around me, whether Parsi, Hindu, Mohammedan, or European, as my brethren. Narayan Guru in Kerala gave a similar call. One religion, one caste, one God for mankind. Amartya Sen has often emphasized, for example, in two of his major works, The Idea of Justice and The Argumentative Indian, the existence of this dialogical tradition which Nehru was talking about. The dialogical tradition, the questioning mind, the ability to live with difference. He points out how in Sanskrit you find far more questioning than you find in other classical texts. He talks about Ashoka, talks about the medieval period, and he also focuses on Akbar. This he sees as being critical in the acceptance and success of the democratic idea among the Indian people. In other words, he too is questioning the notion that democracy is a Western notion which is unsuitable somehow to the Eastern and to the Occident. In questioning that, he in fact says that it is the other way around, that there were strong roots for the democratic tradition, because the heart of democracy, he said, is the dialogical tradition, and India had a very long history in that tradition. One may add that the scientific historical evolution of the Indian civilization was not simply an aid, not simply something to be utilized by Gandhi, Nehru, and our national liberation struggle for struggling to promote a transition to modernity. That is, to bring about modern democratic values that had emerged globally. It was not to be used as just an aid to bring about these values. It was perhaps more than that. It may have had a very important role in the content and manner in which the so-called Enlightenment objectives were sought to be achieved. The content and manner of the nation-making process that occurred in India, the content and manner of our transition to modernity. The absence of a notion of transcendental truth, there being the acceptance of the fact that there is the potential of and the possibility of multiple truths and multiple paths to the seeking of truth in the Indian tradition, kept the door open for a dialogical tradition and of living with difference. And most importantly, it kept the avenue open for non-violence and the ethic of reconciliation. It is only when you have the notion of having the final truth, the ultimate truth, the transcendental truth, that you may wish to obliterate the other, often violently, believing that in so doing, you're doing ultimate good. But if you do not have the notion that you have the ultimate truth, then it is very, very difficult to be violent. In fact, I believe that Gandhi's non-violence emerged from this philosophical position rather than just from its practical applicability in the political situation that India faced. The Enlightenment project globally often faltered on this ground, where this notion of possessing the ultimate truth often justified mass murder, negating a critical aspect of democracy itself, the critical aspect of the Enlightenment project itself. Witness the destruction that followed the great and heroic, the French, the Russian, and the Chinese revolutions. The means used to achieve the ends distorted in many ways the end in itself. The Indian national revolution was achieved, fortunately, without this denouement. Gandhi drew from this tradition the notion of the possibility of alternate truths and the consequence, and as a consequence, his insistence on non-violence. For him, one could only search for truth. There was no given final truth. You could only be in search for the truth. Even religion, Hinduism for Gandhi, was a search for truth. And a search for truth, that too by non-violent means. Truth, he said, was God. And even a non-believer in search of truth could call himself a Hindu. So he described a Hindu in a very, very, very typically, I would say, ancient Indian manner indeed. Nonviolence remained the broad consensus, at least in practice, if not in theory, throughout the Indian national movement, except very brief episodes. This remained the consensus. Adopting this nation-making course, non-violent nation-making course, based on the ethic of reconciliation, perhaps enabled the Indian effort to make this transition to modernity to be less painful and more in tune with the Enlightenment objectives than was achieved in the West. The second aspect, this is an argument which has been very brilliantly made by a philosopher, historian called Tad Ferney. The second aspect of India's civilizational history, that of the ability to live with difference, accommodation, ability to adjust, resolve, transform, rather than crush difference, played a major role in the Indian national movement's imagination of celebrating diversity. That is, the fact that the national movement was not forced towards homogenization was very much part of this civilizational heritage. And here too, the Indian experiment at transition to modernity and nation making had something valuable to offer to the rest of the world. It is this great civilizational heritage on which was based one of the most powerful and innovative liberation struggles, which became a model for scores of other struggles, from the American civil rights movements to the African anti-apartheid movement, to the Polish solidarity movement, to the Arab Spring in recent years. It is this which Gandhiji called the soul of India, which is under grave threat today. And it appears that the reserves of this civilization, its genius, is at test. A test the country can scarcely afford to fail. Thank you.
Professor Bagchi, you need to unmute yourself, please.
Okay. Thank you very much, Aditya. There are many takeaways from what you have said, and I agree with practically all of it. The takeaways that I have from there are the stress on civil liberty in every person who had struggled for Indian independence. There is an article by A.M.S. Hezer where he said that what the Nazis did in Auschwitz or Belsen was something that the colonialists had already done in the countries that they ruled. And before A.M.S. Hezer, in fact, Tagore had, in his great novel Gora, shown how the British had trampled on the civil liberties of both the rich and the poor, both on the poor villagers and on Gora who had come to assist them. That's one very important part. The second one that I found very fascinating, and that is something completely new to me, is Gandhi's stress on democracy within the Congress party. That every decision was taken on the basis of voting, and generally Gandhi won because of his obviously political astuteness and wisdom, but he tolerated dissent to the extent that when the communists did not support the 1942 resolution, he did not condemn them. This is also something new to me. That kind of tolerance could only come from a very great man like Gandhi. And the third takeaway, which I also know, is that whoever struggled for India's independence had necessarily had to have a secular idea, because without secularism you could not have united people of all faiths, all languages, all ethnicities. And here the contrast that you cited from Rothermund is very interesting, the contrast between Akbar and Philip II. But I'd also put the contrast between Akbar and Queen Elizabeth I, whose great enemy was Philip II. Elizabeth was also strongly and violently Protestant. Under her rule, the Catholics were more or less disenfranchised. They are jailed unless they could change their religion and so on. And the fourth one is that with the rise of the capitalist nation states, there was also an aggrandizement. This is not to be true in the case of Britain and the Netherlands. They became fiercely imperialist and colonialist countries from the time they became capitalist. But this was true in the case of the Italian city-states also, with Venice, with Genoa, with Florence. They are all initially not only capitalist but also colonialist, either directly conquering islands in the Aegean or conquering Sicily, or imposing a kind of indirect rule on the countries with which they traded. So I am taking away all these very important points from your speech. And may I also point out that long before the discovery of India, Tagore had written a poem called Bharat Tirtha, where he said that এই ভারতের মহামানবের সাগর তীরে, where all the invaders have come and merged with the Indian people, the Huns, the Shakas, the Mughals, the Pathans, and so on. So I think you have given again a very interesting idea of how the Indian civilization concept informed the national struggle. Thank you very much again.
Thank you, Professor Bagchi.
Thank you so much, sir. We have a few questions for Professor Mukherjee. Can I read them?
Please.
Yeah. One from Shashwat Bhattacharya. There are two questions from him, where he says, how can we define the term Bengal Renaissance? Do we need to see it as the impact of Western thought, or can we see it separately, or is it just a misnomer? And the second point he raises is, can we say the Hinduism emerging in the latter half of the 19th century was a selective Hinduism, which is selecting the elements of Hinduism according to its needs?
Yeah, as for the firstly, I'm not an expert in either of these two areas. I'm not an expert on what I talked about, as Professor Bagchi told you in the very beginning. Economic history is my area. But from whatever little I know, I would say that the Bengal Renaissance is, as was mentioned by Professor Habib as well, that it also draws, and I try to argue that the Bengal Renaissance also draws from past Indian tradition, as it does from the West. One of the enduring qualities of, again, the Indian civilizational values has been its openness to the world. As again, Sen has pointed out in his work, that in fact, in the periods of openness were the periods of greatest scientific breakthroughs, the greatest advancement in ideas, etc. And the periods when there was a inward-looking, closed-mindedness were the periods of decline. The Bengal Renaissance period is a period of open-endedness, where, as I understand, they picked up from the rest of the world, but they also, and Ram Mohan Roy is a very good example, that he writes his earliest work on the basis of his Arabic and Persian knowledge, rather before he is even familiar with English and French, etc. So, there is this combination of the two, and that is what makes it so remarkable. And the two or three examples, like people like Keshav Chandra Sen and others I mentioned, are examples of people who draw from the tradition as well. And the second question about Hinduism in the late 19th century. Yes, as Nehru pointed out, the word Hindu did not exist. The notion of Hindu as a religion is a very recent one. And even to give you an example, the 1901 census, an example of the continuity of this synthetic tradition, lists in the Western region thousands of people, just in one region, in the Bombay presidency. Thousands of people who, when they were asked what was their religion, they said they were Hindu Muslims, or they said they were Muslim Hindus. So this notion of being a Hindu, and by Hindu meaning one homogeneous unit, is a very recent one, and certainly the colonial period is the period when it is made into one. They force you into one or the other. Just as in the 1880s census in Punjab, when the peasant was asked, "What are you?" he would name his village. He would say, "I'm a Longowal," or "I'm a Phalana," or he would name his village. Then they insisted, "No, what is your religion?" So they would say, "I'm a Hindu Sikh." And they said, "How can this be?" So they said, "Okay, then I'm a Sikh Hindu." They said, "How can that be? You have to choose between the two." You see, this is where something very new is happening. The emergence of an identity, of this narrow identity of Hinduism that you're talking about, definitely emerges in the late 19th century.
Are there any questions anymore?